Good evening. Or morning or afternoon or whenever you're watching it. Hello, greetings, and welcome to another Halloween horror movie review. Today we'll be checking out 1977's BBC adaptation of Dracula. Well, Count Dracula, starring Louis Jourdan. This one was brought to my attention last year by some of you, actually, who asked if I had ever seen it, and I said, I didn't even know such a thing existed. That sounds amazing. So, many of you had told me that, A, it starred Louis Jourdan, B, it was a 1977 BBC adaptation, and we all know how good the BBC is at adapting books, and C, probably one of the more faithful adaptations of the story from the book. So, all of those things got me very curious. I checked out on Amazon, and apparently the DVD was out of print, but I did manage to find it for a decent price. In fact, if you'd like to add it to your collection, I've included an Amazon link in the description for you. Alrighty, well, let's not waste any time and check out Count Dracula today on the Halloween Horror Reviews on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Boy, I gotta tell ya, nobody adapts books for the screen like the BBC. Now, prior to seeing this, I was primarily familiar with Louis Jourdan from the Swamp Thing movies, where he, of course, played the evil scientist Anton Arcane. But those were, of course, quite late in his career, and prior to that, he'd had quite a lengthy career, primarily as a romantic leading man. So hearing that he was playing Dracula in this version, I was really curious, and I thought, yeah, actually, I could totally see that, because Arcane was a very Dracula-esque character in terms of his manner and so forth. So the thing that really stands out about this version for me is that I think it remains to this day the most faithful screen adaptation of Dracula that we've had so far. Now, that said, there are a few minor changes here and there, and obviously things have been condensed somewhat to fit it into the 2.5-hour running time. But for the most part, it's pretty accurate to the book. The whole opening sequence with Harker plays out much like it does in the book. Dracula is the coach driver. When Harker approaches the door and Dracula bids him enter, we don't have the line, "Enter freely and of your own will," but we do have the other lines from that moment in the book. Specifically, he says, "Welcome to my house. Come freely, go safely, and please leave some of the happiness that you bring." So I pulled out my original book just to kind of double check the lines. And first off, it's word for word right out of the book. They rearranged a little bit of the dialogue a little bit in that scene, but otherwise the lines are taken straight from the book. The "enter freely and of your own will" is actually the line before that in the book. So it was kind of interesting to me that they just decided to skip over the one that everybody uses and instead go with the other line, which, you know, in a way is a little bit more of a pleasant greeting for Dracula, a little bit less ominous, a little bit less immediately suspicious, I think. So the rest of Harker's visit plays out much the same as it does in the book. How Harker cuts himself, shaving, and he doesn't see Dracula in the mirror. And I really like how the rest of that scene plays out, because a lot of the time, if Dracula realizes that he's not being seen in the mirror, he acts with hostility a lot of the time. Like, he'll grab the mirror and smash it or something like that. But not this Dracula. This Dracula goes over and picks up the mirror, and he kind of looks at it quizzically. And of course, he doesn't see his reflection in it. He waves his hand in front of the mirror with a cool video effect that shows no reflection. And he taps the mirror and he comments that mirrors can't be trusted because they don't reflect everything. And then he casually tosses it out the window, and you hear it smash on the ground below. So again, a little bit more light and casual and not totally suspicious. I mean, Harker's beginning to suspect something's up, but he doesn't really think anything of it because the Count's just being so damn charming. So as in the book, Dracula has Harker stay longer under the pretense that he wants to learn better English for his trip to England. So The scene where Harker meets up with the three vampire brides for the first time is quite interesting in this version, especially given that this was a TV version. In the book, when he meets up with the vampire brides, of course, they all kind of entrance him and are about to eat him. And Dracula shows up and pulls them off of him. And, well, the same thing happens here. But there's an additional part of that scene that we don't always see, even in the gorier movie versions. And this is straight out of the book. Harker had earlier seen Dracula climbing down the side of the building. That's something we also don't see in a lot of the movie versions. Harker sees this every night, where Dracula climbs out the window and literally climbs down the side of the building to the street below. What he does when he's out, who knows? Well, after Dracula pulls the vampire brides off him, they're all kind of whining and lamenting. It's like, oh, are we to have nothing? And he's like, no, no, no. There's something for you in the bag over there. So they go over to the bag, open it up, and there's a baby in the bag. So putting two and two together, you realize, okay, he's going out night after night, not just to feed himself, but also to feed them, to bring them things to eat. So they kind of skirt around the death of the baby fairly cleverly. They don't really show anything overly graphic. However, it shows them picking up the baby and burying their fangs, and then they're kind of in shadow, and then you see them with blood dripping all down them, and you know what's happened. So yeah, pretty intense having the, baby killing scene in this one. That's one that most movie versions shy away from, but this one basically showed it as much as they possibly could on 1977 BBC television. But honestly, I think that's an important scene because it really shows just how evil and remorseless these creatures are. We're just cattle to them. So Harker more or less passes off that experience as a bad dream, but other things happen over the course of his time in Castle Dracula that begin to build a lot of suspicion, not the least of which being Dracula locks him in his room every night so he can't actually go out exploring. He begins to feel that he's more of a prisoner than a guest. And then finally, of course, much like in the book, Dracula has him write a series of letters indicating that he's going to be staying in the country for a while and expanding his business contacts, and it might be a while before he gets back. Basically just to delay any suspicion for his disappearance. So by then, Dracula will be long gone in England, doing whatever he's going to do there, and Harker, well, will most likely be dead by then. But because of the letters and the delayed posting of them, it will seem that he died much later and elsewhere long after his time at Castle Dracula, thus allaying any suspicion. Dracula's been around a long time. He knows how to work the system. So one thing that's established in the opening scene is that Jonathan Harker knows shorthand, and Mina Harker, his fiancée, is in the process of learning shorthand. So wanting to alert Mina to the potential danger that he's in and tell her of his suspicions, he writes a letter to her in shorthand and tries to get a couple of passing gypsies to mail it for him. What he doesn't know, however, is those gypsies are in the employ of Dracula, and they immediately give the letter to Dracula. Now, things play out a little differently here than they do in the original book. In the original book, he finds the letter, he reads it, he understands it, and he's outraged by it. He presents it to Harker, and you get the feeling that he knows Harker wrote it, and he's just kind of playing with him to see if he'll admit it or not. But of course, Harker doesn't admit anything, just pleads ignorance, so Dracula throws it in the fire, so the letter goes unsent. In this case, he presents the letter to Harker and says, "Yes, my men gave me this letter. It's written in strange hieroglyphics. Perhaps you'll find it amusing." And he gives it back to Harker. Just like he doesn't even need to throw it in the fire. He has everyone in the vicinity so firmly in his control, he knows. He knows. He knows Harker wrote that letter, and he knows that it's never going to get sent unless he allows it. So Harker is, of course, imprisoned in the castle, and the last we see is the vampire brides closing in on him. Meanwhile, there's a short scene of the boat going across a very fake-looking ocean. But hey, 1977 BBC TV budget, what can you do? Sometimes you just got to suspend your disbelief a little bit. So we just very briefly touch on the events of the boat, where the crew's been disappearing. There's just the captain left, and he lashes himself to the wheel, and that's pretty much it. And then from there, the story moves to England, where we see how Mina's been doing, and we meet her sister, Lucy Westenra. I don't know how Mina Harker's sister is Lucy Westenra. Well, I guess it's Mina Westenra? Anyway, they were just friends in the book, but in this version, they're sisters for some reason. And speaking of Lucy, checking the Lucy Westenra pseudometer, who's the lucky man this time? Quincy P. Holmwood? For some reason, they did away with Arthur entirely and basically just gave Quincy Arthur's last name. So rather than Quincy P. Morris, it's Quincy P. Holmwood instead of Arthur Holmwood and Quincy P. Morris. Yeah, Dr. Seward is in it, and Renfield is in it, but we'll get to them in just a couple minutes. So even though Quincy shares Arthur's last name, the character is very much Quincy. Now, the vast majority of the story from this point plays out much as it does in the book. So Lucy has fallen mysteriously ill, she's lost a lot of blood, so they call in Van Helsing as a specialist in strange diseases to try to figure out what's going on. And let me say, Frank Finlay as Van Helsing pretty much instantly became one of my favorite Van Helsings. Like, right up there with Edward Van Sloan. He was so good in this. And I love his bedside manner with Lucy, where Lucy's already starting to show signs that she's starting to turn. Her teeth are beginning to show fangs and so forth. So when he first meets her, he's examining her, and he's being very gentle, very gracious, not suspicious at all. He's like, oh, just let me look at your neck there. And it's like, okay, that's good. And now if I could just check your teeth. I was like, okay, that's good. Just excellent bedside manner, not creating any suspicion whatsoever. Everything's just very casual, very clinical. But you know, as he's seeing each of these things and why he's asking to look at these very specific things is because he already is suspecting what's going on. So one thing we see in this version, which we don't see in a lot of the other adaptations, is they give Lucy multiple blood transfusions, trying to replenish all of the blood that she keeps losing. First, it's one of the chambermaids offering her blood, and then Quincy offers his blood, and then they just, they keep giving her all these transfusions. It's not quite as many as in the book, but you definitely get a sense that they've had to do this a number of times, because every night, every other night, she keeps losing all this blood, and they don't know what's going on. Of course, we know is because Dracula keeps coming to visit her and drains her almost nightly. Now, Jack Shephard as Renfield. Fast became one of my all-time favorite Renfields. A very different kind of portrayal from what we normally see. He's, a lot of the time, very calm, almost lucid, yet there's this underlying tension where it's like he's struggling to keep that sane face going when he's talking to somebody, but there's a lot going on upstairs. And there are moments where he just cracks and he can't hold it in anymore, and he has these manic outbursts. But what a wonderful layered performance by Jack Shephard. Just amazing. I'm absolutely entranced every time he's on the screen. So after Lucy finally dies and is entombed, Van Helsing and Quincy go off to check her grave and find it empty. So as they're looking around, saying, well, where did she go? Where did she go? And he's trying to convince Quincy, like, no, she's now walking as one of the undead. We have to find her and we have to destroy the body. So as they're walking around at night looking for Lucy, they encounter a little boy. And Van Helsing picks him up and he says, oh, it's, what have you got there? And he's got a flower. And he says, I've got a flower for the beautiful lady. It's like, oh, what beautiful lady? The beautiful lady, the flower. And he's just kind of rambling. You can't really. So Van Helsing picks him up and he looks. And the little boy has 2 bite marks on his neck. And it's just, you just feel Van Helsing's heart breaking. And he's just like, oh, no, not already, not so soon. So he knows they have to find Lucy and they have to stop her. So they do. They actually run into her because she was, I guess, tracking the boy. She almost attacks Quincy, but Van Helsing manages to stop her and she flees. So they go back to the tomb, and sure enough, there she is. So at that point, Quincy's convinced. It's like, okay, yeah, I believe you now. And so Van Helsing performs the rites of the dead, and Quincy drives the stake through Lucy's heart. And quite a gory scene, too, might I add, for 1977 BBC television. So it's around this time that they've been talking to Dr. Seward, and Dr. Seward has told them about Renfield. And in hearing about him, Van Helsing thinks there may be some kind of connection there. He may know something about what happened with Lucy. So Dr. Seward, of course, knows Mina fairly well, because Dr. Seward was one of Lucy's suitors, so he agrees to let Mina come and meet Renfield. So they meet and they have a very pleasant conversation. Renfield kind of tells her a little bit about how he used to hold this strange belief, how by consuming life he could prolong his own life, and that he would eat insects and things like that. And Dr. Seward says, oh, you don't have this belief anymore? And Renfield doesn't answer. But it's a very lovely, very pleasant conversation. And Renfield ends it by saying to Mina that he hopes he never sees her again. So now, of course, Dracula has turned his attention to Mina. So he starts coming to her in the night. And at one point she feels it might be helpful to speak with Renfield again, because now she's afraid that the same thing is happening to her that happened to Lucy, and if he knows anything, he might be able to shed some light on what's going on. So she goes to meet Renfield again. And interestingly enough, at first, Renfield doesn't recognize her. He insists that they've never met before. Of course, what this means is he can sense that she has changed, and he likely knows that it was Dracula that did it, but he's afraid and he doesn't want to get involved, because while he falls over himself to worship Dracula, he is also terrified of him. And if this is someone that Dracula has a vested interest in, he doesn't want to get in the way and incur his wrath. Now, interestingly enough, in the book, he talks about his second meeting with Mina, but we don't actually see that meeting in the book. So in this case, they've actually shown us the meeting itself. Also, Mina and Renfield have a conversation about souls, where in the book, that's actually a conversation that he had with Dr. Seward. So they've transposed that over to Mina, which I think in a way makes it more interesting, because they're kind of discussing the nature of life and death and souls and the connection of the soul to life and things like that. And it obviously gives Renfield a lot of food for thought, far more than he had considered previously. So in the book, of course, he attacked Dracula thinking that being a madman, he had enough strength that he could take him on. But, of course, he didn't. And essentially we find out everything that I just described to you as he's dying, and he's telling it to Dr. Seward and Van Helsing. In this case, when Dracula comes to see Renfield, he tells him about Mina. He says, previously I was only giving you insects, but now I'm giving you a human. I've already initiated her for you. You can take of her life to prolong your own for as long as you like. But Renfield, having met and gotten to know Mina a little bit, is horrified by this and essentially turns on Dracula and attacks him. Needless to say, Dracula kills him. And then as he's laying dying, confessing to Van Helsing and Dr. Seward, saying he was only trying to protect Mina. So meanwhile, over the course of this, Van Helsing, Quincy, and Harker, yes, Harker actually escaped and made his way back to England, and they found him, and he's all better now, and he's helping them to track down Dracula. They're all trying to find the boxes of earth that were transported on the ship. Now, just like in the book, there are 50 boxes of earth. And over the course of time and several investigations, they're able to find and consecrate and destroy 49 of them. So there's one more remaining that they can't find. And there's a lovely scene where they're discussing how many they found, how many they've destroyed, where they found them. And as they're talking about it, Van Helsing is making cocoa for everybody. I don't know, it was just a little thing where they had Frank Finlay making cocoa for everybody as they're having this conversation. I just thought it was a nice, charming little Van Helsing scene. Just that they're doing all this horrible, dirty work and just enjoying some nice hot cocoa together. There's a scene where Dracula comes to Mina in the night, and I love this scene because it perfectly encapsulates what Dracula is and what we are to Dracula. So he's just bitten and drank of her, and he's sitting very close to her, and he asks her, he says, "Do you know the meaning of the kiss?" The kiss meaning the bite on the neck. And he says to her, right to her face, "You are my nourishment, my beautiful little wine press." And that is it. That is it in a nutshell. We are literally food. There is no romance. There is no genuine passion. There is only passion for the purpose of entrancing. And as he's telling her this, she's all like, "Oh, that's..." just like completely in his power. And he knows. She's completely in his power. He can tell her this to her face, literally saying, "You are food to me and nothing more." And she loves it. So I believe it was at this point that he does the slash across his chest and then has her drink of him. So now they are connected. And just like in the book, this actually proves to be to Van Helsing's advantage, because now they can use Mina's connection to Dracula to determine where he's going. So having destroyed 49 of his 50 boxes, Dracula is heading back to Transylvania. So they've got to get back and stop him. As they're going, there's a wonderful scene, which again is right out of the book, and again seems to get skipped by almost every version of Dracula out there. Harker and Quincy have gone off ahead to try to get to the castle ahead of Dracula. Meanwhile, Van Helsing is going off with Mina, and they stop and camp for the night, and as they're camping, the three vampire brides show up. They're very close to the castle at this point, so the three vampire brides show up, and they're calling to Mina to come to them, to be with them, to join with them. And Van Helsing immediately starts to take action to protect them. So what he does is he draws a circle in the dirt around Mina, and then he has this container of communion wafers. He takes the communion wafers and breaks them up and sprinkles the bits all around the circle. So it's kind of like a circle of salt, but it's a circle of things that vampires cannot pass. So he asks Mina to come and join him by the fire, but she can't get out of the circle. Okay, so he's established that she can't cross the circle. She's almost completely turned. She's still not quite there, but enough that these things can stop her. In fact, there was a scene where he touched a communion wafer to her forehead, and it burned her forehead. So she can't leave the circle, but nor can the three vampire brides get in. So he goes into the circle with Mina and holds her and protects her. And meanwhile, he's got two halves of communion wafers that he's using to ward off the vampire brides. And he keeps warding them off and warding them off all night long. And that's right out of the book. That is a very, tense, intense scene. And I was really glad to see that in this version. And you really feel the tension. I mean, I don't think there's even any music in that scene. It's just the whispers and mocking laughter of the brides as they're trying to get into the circle and trying to get at Van Helsing, and Mina's struggling, and Van Helsing is just keeping an eye on where they are, and it's intense, man. Really intense. So morning comes. Now, much like the book, sunlight is not deadly to vampires. It just saps them of their strength. So they're more powerful at night. Knowing that she's safe, that she can't leave the circle, and none of the vampires can get into the circle, and it's day, Van Helsing goes off ahead to Castle Dracula, finds the resting places of the vampire brides, and stakes all three of them. Then he goes back to get Mina. Meanwhile, Dracula's almost back to the castle, so they've got to get there before he does. By this point, it's almost sundown, and they've got to head him off and stop him before it's sundown, before he's at full strength again. So in this case, I can forgive this change. Van Helsing stakes him through the heart just as the sun is going down. Yeah, I mean, Van Helsing has been so firmly established as the big hero of the Dracula story that you pretty much have to have him drive in the final stake at the end, just to kind of bring it all together. So there was a few minor things that they took from later revisions of the story, such as the stake through the heart and whatnot. But for the most part, it remained faithful to the book in that sunlight was not deadly. It just drains their powers, so they're not as powerful. But also the thing with the communion wafers, and they have wreaths of garlic and crucifixes and things like that. So, other than some very minor changes, just to, I think, kind of make it a little bit easier to condense things, this, again, is easily the most accurate version to the book that I have ever seen. And I've watched a lot of different Draculas over the past couple of years, and this one has yet to be beat for sheer accuracy. Plus, it's got such a great cast. Louis Jourdan, Jack Shepherd, Frank Finlay, and also the actresses who play Lucy and Mina, whose names escape me at the moment, are absolutely wonderful. Just really deeply talented actors who just throw themselves into their respective roles. And there you have it. So, yeah, once again, big thanks to all of you who recommended this one to me. It has fast become one of my favorite versions of Dracula. I think I've watched this about 4 times since getting it, and one of which was a group viewing with some of you, actually. So, yeah, it's great stuff. If you like 70s BBC stuff as much as I do, you should definitely check this out. Plus, I mean, it's just, as I say, such a faithful adaptation. Check it out. It's great. Alrighty, that is it from me to you for now, so I'll see you next time. Until then, thanks for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors, and sayonara. Afraid to move around too much in this costume because it's so flimsy. Looks great, but it's very flimsy. I made a typo in my notes here. Instead of how Harker cuts himself, I said how Harker butts himself. But welcome back. Okay, so this is good. You should watch it. Thanks. Which was interesting to me because so the rest of Harker's visit plays out much the same as it does in the book. So just read the fucking book. And you'll basically have seen the movie in text form. The end.